is this one coming up in just 2 short weeks. So that concert will feature the chorus, and it will be, Gerhard is taking this one off, so it will just be Britt and Matthew will be the conductors for that one. Also on your table, we just announced our next season, so you'll see these cards here. So subscriptions are now available for next year already. I'm excited about next season, so I hope you will be too. Don't forget to sign in. With our special grant that we have from the Ohio Humanities Council, we do need to have you sign in. And with that, I'm going to let Britt talk. You don't need to hear me. So enjoy.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am here to talk about the classical mass, which is a fascinating topic on a lot of fronts. We'll come at it from a lot of perspectives. We will talk about music and worship in general, very briefly first, to just sort of set the table. Talk a little bit about the classical period in music, talk about some other composers you probably haven't heard of relative to the classical mass, and then talk about the ones you already know. The Mozarts and the Haydns and the Mozarts and the Haydns and the Mozarts and the Haydns, right? So, with that, let's dive in. So, the role of music in worship. First rule is that it's always been there. As long as worship has existed, apparently, as far as we can tell, we have always engaged in music through worship. And I think a big part of that is that no matter what religion, faith, denomination, or whatever you believe in, most people kind of agree on the rudimentary elements of what worship is. Worship is personal self-expression, and worship is communion with other people. So personal self-expression, music checks that box very handsomely, thank you. And then the idea of worship in communion, as someone once said, our God may indeed be one, but it may take two to find him. And so, with that sort of concept in mind, then there isn't much that brings people together more than singing the same note on the same vowel with the same intention. Just get a group of people say, just to do Hallelujah, and all of a sudden they're a unit, they're together spiritually in a way that they wouldn't be almost any other way. So music has always been that way. It has always been a part of worship. Sure, I'll get my little magic button here. A big question regarding the nature of music and worship has to do with who's in charge, who's calling the shots. Sometimes it is the individual church that calls the shots. Sometimes it's a particular pastor or a minister who calls the shots. Sometimes it is the church, the big church. In the instance of the Catholic Church, you're talking about the Vatican and the Pope. Sometimes it's a donor. I've never been in a church like that, but yeah, sometimes it's a donor. Sometimes, obviously, culture has something to do with the nature of music at any given point in history anyway. Sometimes it's an element of the state, government. The government actually gets its hands in it throughout history. At least in theory, we're not supposed to do that in this country, but in other countries throughout history, that has certainly been the case, and we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Yeah. Another curiosity to me has to do with the role of the congregation, the larger collective in musical worship, because sometimes they're involved and sometimes they're not. There are instances in history where musical worship happens over here and everybody else just sort of experiences it. Whereas at other times in history, it has been very intentional that everybody's involved. And that affects the music. The music by its nature has to be simpler. It has to be something that everybody can do. If you're in a culture and a time where sort of specialists can do the heavy lifting with the music, and you don't feel like the congregation has to be involved all the time, that changes the role of the music and changes, again, how complicated the music can be. How artful can it be? How professionally elegant can it be? And so that obviously manifests itself big time during the classical period, and we'll talk about that. So the Catholic Church. I have a fascinating relationship with the Catholic Church. I work at a Catholic school. I have some of my colleagues here today. How you doing? I am a non-Catholic working at a Catholic school. And so I have a unique perspective. Every once in a while, one of my colleagues will ask me, why did you come up with that programming idea? That was fascinating. I said, I don't know. For example, I created a program one time that used the Catholic Mass, the traditional elements of the Mass, which we'll talk about in a minute, and I filled it with different ingredients. I filled it with things that were like the Kyrie, like the Gloria, and like the Credo, but they weren't. There was something else. And I just created a program that was like that. And people came up to me and said, I'm so glad you're not Catholic. A Catholic never would have thought to do that. Or there were other people that said, you shouldn't have done that. Of course, you have both sides of it. People who appreciate the creativity of it and, sort of paying homage to the tradition while doing it in a different way. While other people said, no, you don't do that. So, the Catholic Church has a long and winding, because it has such a long and winding history, that's one of the things that makes the Catholic Church unique as opposed to the Methodists and even the Lutherans, who have been around for quite a while, but not as long as the Catholics. They have a very long and winding history as it relates to music and worship and its attitudes about music and worship. If you go back to the very, very early days, I'll pick that up there. To the very early days of the church, go back to the medieval period, music was primarily driven by chant. And there are an awful lot of people who think that when we got away from chant, that's when everything went wrong. And that's the way to be. And of course, in recent times, we've come back to singing a lot of chant in Latin masses in church. And there's a great beauty to it. One of the beauties of singing chant is it does have, it is a style of music that is approachable to anyone. If you want to and you are willing to, you can sing chant. Let me get my handy dandy machine going here. Got your button. Where's the button? Thank you. A simple example of a chant would go like this. It's music that can, again, be sung by everyone. It wasn't always sung by everyone, though. Often it was sung by the monks of the church, or it could be sung by the women of the church if you were in an abbey or cloister. It depended on the church, it depended on the time. But it usually wasn't everybody who was actually engaged. But the music was written in such a way that it could be. It was very often sort of call and response. There would be a leader who would sing an incipit, and then it would be followed by a collection of voices. That's a tradition that goes back centuries as well. The music is approachable, and it stays that way for a pretty long time. And then you get to the end of the medieval period, around 1200 or 1300, and we start mucking it up. And not only does the music start to become more complex in terms of multiple voices going on at the same time, so-called organum, but you actually had different texts going on at the same time. People have just taken the original chant, they've stretched it out, and they create these tropes, which are other texts. Might be sacred, might be secular. It starts to dance. There's all kinds of heck breaking loose at this point. And that goes on for a while, and then we have the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, and the music of the church becomes simpler again. It becomes simpler from the perspective that within the Counter-Reformation, we pretty much say, okay, let's get back to one text, let's get back to Latin, and let's get back to music that is in such a style so that the words can be actually understood, that you can actually hear the words being sung as they go by. And so an example of a wonderful Counter-Reformation composer would be Palestrina, and this is the Gloria for Miss Pope Marcellus Mass. But that's the music of the Counter-Reformation. So by that time, you're almost all the way up to the year 1600. Instruments have come in and out of the church at that point, but the age of instrumental music in worship really begins with the Baroque, begins with the late 1600s, mid 1600s onward. There are 5 texts in the so-called Mass Ordinary that are set by composers regularly. There are other pieces and parts which are sometimes set. The other piece that is sometimes set by composers, though rarely, is the so-called Ita Missa Est at the very end, which is basically the closing blessing. But the Kyrie is actually Greek. It's the oldest part of the Mass. It means Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. And then the Gloria is the great hymn of praise, glory to God in the highest. The Credo is the creed, a collection of ideas agreed upon by the Council of Nicaea, I believe, back in the year 300, blah, 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 I don't remember exactly. I believe in God, Father the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and all the seen and unseen, and his Lord Jesus Christ, forever. It's a long text. And it's always interesting to talk to our students at Walsh after Mass, because I'll say, how did Mass go today? It's fine. They said it was really long. They chanted all the texts. They actually chanted today. Sometimes you chant the text, sometimes you speak the text of these things. And if a priest comes in and wants to chant everything, then it lasts longer, because it takes longer to sing than it does to just speak it. So that's one of the things we'll talk about. The sheer length of the Mass becomes a point of contention. You know, can it be 3 hours long? Maybe, maybe not. Depends on the time, depends on the era you're talking about. When we get to the classical era, they're going to get real persnickety about that. They're going to start saying, we are watching the clock. So there's a creed. The Sanctus is the Holy, Holy, Holy. It's another hymn of praise. The Benedictus is often separated by composers, especially in the classical era that we'll talk about later. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So that happens. There's a Hosanna at the end of each. And then it ends as it begins with a hymn of supplication. Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, have mercy on us. There are lots of Trinity references to the Agnus Dei in terms of how many petitions there are. And so very often an Agnus Dei is written in 3/4 time, because why wouldn't you? But sometimes not. Just depends. Depends on how literal they want to get with all this stuff. I already talked about the medieval and the Counter-Reformation. I also just want to mention the modern church in the Catholic universe, because particularly as it references congregational singing. This is an aspect where the Catholics are really much more intentional than they have been perhaps historically in a long time. Because if you go to a Catholic church and you go to Mass and the people are asked to sing, they actually usually sing. That isn't always the case in all denominations of the Christian church or other faiths either, but it's actually a point of emphasis, and it's meaningful. If there is a holy holy, if there is a sanctus or whatever, people usually sing it. They also usually sing most churches only know 3 or 4, so they just sort of cycle them over and over again, and they're comfortable with them, and so they sing them, and that's fine. But the nature of the music has changed a lot over time, but the emphasis on congregational singing now is much more than it was in, say, the classical period, which we'll get to here in just a minute. So, most of you know classical music, know the music that we're talking about, the late 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment. And when people talk about that music, they tend to talk about it as being very reserved and very refined. And they talk about it not being an age of overt expression and everything is very formalized and all that, right? And that's all true, but I always think it's important to remember it within the context of a balance between formalism and expressive qualities and its intentions. A book I was reading recently was talking about the classical period and defined the 3 biggest characteristics of the classical period being its relationship to the Rococo ideologies of really the mid-18th century, which comes from French architecture. It suggests lightness and grace. One of the things that you think about music from the classical period, it all seems lighter. It seems more buoyant. It seems to be, it feels more like Viennese whipped cream rather than German chocolate cake. You know what I mean? It has a lightness to it, and it has this sense of it just sort of bounding from musical moment to musical moment. It doesn't have the weight that it will have later on. And not even there's some Baroque music that has that weight too, in a way. But the classical period has a buoyancy and a lightness to it that I think that's important. The style galant, the sort of refined, music that's refined and accessible rather than learned and academic. See, there's an idea that sort of runs at variance to the way a lot of us think about classical music. Because you think about the formalism of classical music, you think about sonata form, and if you've ever looked at the graphs of what a sonata form looks like, it looks like the worst calculus equation you've ever seen in your life. But the music actually is intended to be accessible. Think about eine kleine Nachtmusik. Think about the simple melodies that come out of the classical era, and that is sort of that is a wished for outcome in this music, more so than perhaps we give it credit for. And then the empfindsamer Stil, which is the sentimental style, something that is uncomplicated and direct, but specifically in terms of expression, in terms of conveying a sentiment, an attitude, joy, sorrow, or something like it, and doing it unreservedly and doing it certainly in a stylized way, but doing it in a way that's direct and not sort of heard from around a corner. This is an interesting quote from an aesthetician, is what I'm trying to say, and I can't say it all of a sudden, named Johann Georg Sulzer. We can say that proper German. It goes like this. It's from something called the General Theory of the Beautiful Art. The most important, if not the only function of a perfect musical composition is the accurate expression of sentiments and passions with all their particular shadings. Every composition, whether it is vocal or instrumental, should possess a definite character and be able to arouse specific sentiments in the minds of listeners. Expression is the soul of music. Amen to that, say I. If you think about the person who is sort of the star of our show today, Haydn, since that's the piece I'll be conducting in 2 weeks. The one expression, the one sentiment which appears to be the most apparent in every piece Haydn ever wrote, it's joy. It is just unbridled. The man was just so darn happy. And he didn't always have to be. I mean, there were reasons why he shouldn't have been happy. He had a struggling marriage and all that other sort of stuff, but he did have some good things going for him. He had a patron who supported him for over 40 years. That's kind of rare in the music biz at any time in history. And so his music is just so full of joy. I've always had the feelings that in most of his music, when he's trying to be passionate and he's trying to be really serious and severe, it's almost like he has to pretend to be somebody else. He has to pretend to be Mozart, or he has to pretend to be Bach, or he has to pretend to be Beethoven. He has to sort of put on a facade, because his default is always happy, happy, happy. It's always such full of joy and happiness. Anyway, so moving on. So moving into the classical period from the Baroque, the roles of Germany and Austria reverse. In the Baroque period, Germany is the lead dog. They are the ones that are conveying the importance, or they're the ones that are influencing and impacting. Whereas when you move into the late 18th century, it clearly shifts to Austria, and especially Vienna. And with that comes a shift in the types of pieces that are influential. In Germany, you're talking about chorales, chorale motets, cantatas, everything coming out of the Lutheran Church. At the end of the 18th century, it switches back to Catholicism. You get more masses. The important pieces are masses, they're magnificats, they're Te Deums, they're individual mass movements. Throughout all of this time period, people are writing individual mass movements as much as they're writing full masses. You know, the idea of writing a mass that goes from beginning to end is all one piece, that's all great, but people also would write just a Sanctus, they would write a Gloria, they would write a Kyrie. That always happened through there. Who's in charge? This is what makes this time period a little bit unique, is that the people who are in charge at this time actually aren't always church leaders. They are members of the state, okay? They are, if you're talking about you're in the age of the absolute monarch in Europe, it's coming to the conclusion at the end of the 18th century. It had been even more on a stronger footing at the beginning of the 18th century before the French Revolution and everything else. But there is sort of a battle between the church and the state for control of the church, for control of local churches. And there are certain figures in parts of Europe that are going to try to have a more commanding control over what goes on in the church in their environment, because that is where power lies for them, and that's where they can control people, or at least in their eyes. There's a stylistic shift that occurs which from the end of the Baroque into the classical period. At the end of the Baroque period, music is now very, very, the Mass has become an instrumental form with a chorus. The congregation isn't involved at all. They're sitting back and listening. And the pieces are vast. You can have Glorias that have 5 separate movements, Credos that have 6. And they can just go on for days and days and days and days and days. They're a long drink of water. Several of the movements are separated as arias. Remember, this is the age of the rise of opera. And so within the midst of Gloria or Credo, there will be a moment that is meant for a solo trio, or sometimes an individual soloist. And the solos they're singing are very florid, lots and lots of melismas and ornamentation. So very much a part of the of what you would expect in the Baroque style. In other words, what has been happening on the stage in the concert hall has worked its way into the church. which is another fight that goes back and forth throughout history. You know, every once in a while it creeps in, and then the church goes, "Get out of here, we don't want your kind," and it comes back in, and it's always a never-ending struggle back and forth. Well, cue Emperor Joseph II. He's the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and he is known as the musical king. He is very much engaged and interested in the music of the time. But he wants to change things within the church, and with the help of an archbishop who he becomes an ally with, the Archbishop Colloredo from Salzburg, who was famous for originally being a patron of Mozart, young Mozart. He puts in place a series of reformed mandates that change the classical mass. They're going to be shorter in length. They're going to be much less florid in style. All portions of the ordinary are going to be one movement. None of this multi-movement stuff, that goes away. Solo writing is largely syllabic and scored mostly for ensembles, so the solos where the soprano gets to be a songbird are gone. And instead of them going, they can one syllable per note. Thank you very much. So, no more of that Beyonce stuff. We're just going to keep it straight. And so out of those mandates, you end up with two distinct styles which become common in the classical mass. Two structures. One is called the Missa Brevis. The Missa Brevis absolutely adheres to what the emperor is talking about. These are short masses. Some of them are no longer, I mean, if you play all of the movements back to back to back to back, some of them are no more than 12 minutes long. And they are very, very concise. And we will talk a little bit about some of the tools that composers had to use to sometimes achieve that level of brevity. Because as we mentioned before, some of these are long texts. The Credo is a long song. The Gloria is not a short, it's not three lines, it's long. How do you do that? Well, they figured it out. Then you also have the Missa Solemnis. There are masses that are for festival occasions, for feast days and other special occasions that were approved by the state and occasionally by the archbishop or whomever, in which you could then do the more extended mass, and you could have all the bells and whistles that people had grown accustomed to. And that was called the Missa Solemnis. You've heard of a piece by Beethoven called the Missa Solemnis that is 2 hours monster, this huge thing. Well, that's where this piece came from. Probably the other sort of archetype Missa Solemnis would be the Mass in B minor of Bach. He never meant for it to actually be performed in his lifetime. It's an hour and 45 minutes of pure majesty, but it's not meant for liturgical use. You couldn't have a liturgy and do the Mass in B minor. That would be a very, it would be glorious. Maybe my favorite piece of music of all time, but it'd be rough. So remember, Missa Brevis, Missa Solemnis. Real quickly, I want to take you through a handful of composers you don't know anything about, probably, or you might know just a little bit. I don't know much about them either, so I had to do some very exciting research in preparation for this lecture you're now suffering from. The first one is a guy named Johann Adolf Hasse. I can't say anything today, I'm so sorry. He was born in 1699, died in 1783. So he really is an example of somebody who was born in the Baroque and transitions throughout his life into the this classical period. So the majority of his writing experiences the transition from the Baroque to what we call the Rococo into the classical. And so the music that he wrote actually is similarly, it covers all of those areas as well. He was a German opera composer. He actually grew up in the opera house. He wasn't primarily a church musician, he was an opera composer. He wrote 63 operas. Wow, that's a lot. In his spare time, he wrote 17 masses and 3 requiems. It's a lot. He also wrote 36 separate mass movements. And the masses for him primarily are large-scale works. They're big pieces that they're in the style, in the older style where you could do separate movements and that sort of thing. I think for sake of time, I don't think I'm going to play an example of his. I might just sort of move on. Well, maybe think about that. I have one, I think. Yes. I'll play this. Where are you at? This is a part of a mass in D minor that is one of the only pieces that are occasionally performed as this mass in D minor. Let's just listen to a little bit of the Kyrie. Perfectly elegant music. It's quite beautiful. Usually what you hear with the composers that you don't know as much. You're used to Haydn, you're used to Mozart. We pretty much distilled the history of classical music to 2 blokes, right? Whenever you hear somebody else, you go, oh, that's not bad at all. And then you sit there and you listen to it longer and you go, okay, now I know why we don't sing this one anymore. Because it usually doesn't have the level of depth, it doesn't have there'll be something that you'll hear, you'll go, oh, I wish he could have done this little thing, Haydn would have done that, or whatever. And you sit there and you realize why the alphas in history are the alphas. It's not just coincidence. We know more about Wolfgang Mozart's music than we do Leopold Mozart's music. Leopold wrote just as much music. Why don't we know his music? Well, it's not as good. And it doesn't have the same level of sheer creativity. And that's the funny thing about history. History is a filter. The problem with modern music is that there hasn't been a filter yet. we don't know what's going to survive yet, because right now it's all surviving. That music, we don't have that. We've actually, lifetimes of choirs and orchestras and everything else, we go, that's it. And everything else, you go, it's interesting, but maybe not. So, our next item up for bids is Johann Ernst Eberlin, who was born in 1702 and died in 1762. I only include him, 2 reasons. One, he did most of his work in Salzburg, and was a part of a long line of composers who composed in Salzburg and were very influential. So his music actually influences Michael Haydn, not so much Joseph Haydn apparently, and the young Mozart. But he was extremely prolific within the Catholic Church. He wrote 67 masses, including 9 requiems. Apparently lots of people died. They also wrote 13 oratorios. That's one style that we haven't talked about a whole lot that becomes popular again during the classical period, the idea of the oratorio. We'll talk about it a little bit when we get to Haydn because he's got 2 big ones that you have to at least mention. So he wrote 13 oratorios, including 3 passion settings and 200 Latin motets. I didn't know there were 200 different texts that you could set. I'm sure there are, but it didn't occur to me that you could find 200 different texts. There are probably about 12 Ave Marias in there too, so it's probably not a fair association to make. But his music, I searched Spotify and I searched everywhere else. I can't find a recording of this guy. So the music isn't memorable, but it is somebody who was involved at the time and was ultimately influential and very, very prolific. Michael Haydn, who is the younger brother of Franz Joseph, born in 1737. Franz Joseph Haydn was born in 1732, so 5 years younger. Lived almost as long, lived 1806. Excuse me. Became a chorister at St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, like Joseph. Who's been to Vienna? Raise your hand if you've been to Vienna. A few. Have you been to St. Stephen's Cathedral? Yeah. It's a beautiful place. And a lot of composers make their way through Vienna through that choir school at that particular cathedral. Unlike his brother, his older brother, he writes almost exclusively for the church. He is mostly a church musician. For Haydn, that was one of many things that he did. His primary role, of course, was to be Kapellmeister for a patron. And so he wrote whatever he was asked to write. And he wrote tons of, he's the father of the symphony. Big brother Joseph is, so he wrote over 110-ish symphonies. And he wrote a whole bunch of operas, and he wrote all kinds of stuff, in addition to the church music, which was sort of about maybe a quarter to a third of what he did. Michael Haydn was primarily a church composer. He wrote, I have to read my little list here. He wrote 35 masses, including 2 requiems, 6 oratorios, 13 cantatas, one of which I've actually sung. Conducted it. Yeah, I conducted it. Been a long time. 5 Te Deums and 400 motets, 400 Latin motets. So he was a busy guy. There is a piece which was translated into English about 20 years ago, which has actually become a rather popular little church cantata to do at Christmas time, called Run Ye Shepherds to the Light by Michael Haydn. It's 3 movements, maybe 12, 13 minutes long. It's actually very approachable. A lot of church choirs could do it. I conducted it in my very first job when I was 23 or 24 years old. I had no idea what I was doing, but it was a very effective piece and it was a lot of fun. He composed masses in multiple styles over 43 years. His earliest masses actually suggest the prima pratica style of the Renaissance. So he goes back and he actually tries to write music that harkens back to the early practice of, that sounds almost like Palestrina or something. But if you're writing in that style in 1760 or so, you're still going to have accompaniment, you're still going to have probably an organ at least playing or something like that. So it's not going to sound quite the same, but his masses, all those masses over 43 years, really cover a lot of different styles. I'm going to play you an example of one of his early masses that's written in that sort of prima, or that that first practice style, if I can find it. Where'd you go? Yep, there we go. Let's try this one. Great.
Is
example of somebody who is trying to get through the text quickly, okay? Everybody says the words at the same time. It's declamatory, basically blocks of sound. So you're not going to hear any counterpoint. You're not going to have one group doing this and another group doing that and another group doing that. You can't do that and get through a text like a credo. So everybody says it together. And that, like I said, it's prima practica, but it's not. So it's sounds sort of Palestrina-ish, but it has two things that Palestrina would never have. One is the organs playing, and the other is that you can almost dance to it. Still got a little bit of buoyancy, and it's moving. And Palestrina's music, as sort of the archetype of the Counter-Reformation, has this sense of these long, chant-like lines that are happening in very simple counterpoint. So it's prima practica, but it's not. So that's Michael Haydn. And then we get to Wolfie, whose music you know well. And of course, born in Salzburg, worked there before moving to Vienna. Worked for the Archbishop we mentioned earlier, had a very antagonistic relationship with him. Did not like him very much. Kind of had an antagonistic relationship, with kind of everybody. He was kind of a child. But he was a genius, so everybody patted him on the head and said, all right, whatever. Mozart composed 19 masses, most of them early in life. He composed 4 masses between the ages of 12 and 13. Twerp. And 11 were composed while serving the Archbishop of Salzburg. Okay? Probably the most famous mass that isn't a requiem, was the Great Mass in C minor, which was written for his wife Constanza at the time of their wedding. In fact, she sang one of the solos. That particular mass is written in the more Missa Solemnis style. So big piece, lots of separation, a lot of movements within text and that sort of thing. Let me play you the beginning of the Kyrie from the Great Mass in C minor. Always struck me that this is so solemn. I love you, honey. I may not be, not real balancing, not this, a little bit. What'd you say?
Don't try that at home.
Exactly, right. This piece was huge and expansive, and he never finished it. When you hear performances of it, unlike the Requiem, which other people came in and tried to finish, there were enough sketchbooks and things like that that you could sort of guess kind of what Mozart wanted. The Great Mass in C minor was never finished. And so when you hear performances of it, you hear the movements that he actually completed, but not the whole thing. And then, of course, the famous Requiem at the end is probably his most famous mass. And It was a count, some weird name, started with a W, Walsh, something or other, who, this mysterious patron who asked for a requiem mass, who it's believed actually wanted to parade that it was his music and all this sort of stuff. So it was sinister. It's not what's in the movie. The movie's wrong. It's not Salieri, you know that. But, it's a remarkable piece, and it is a piece. Mozart was obviously very, very ill when he was writing it. He didn't finish it. He probably was convinced that he was writing it for himself when it was all said and done, because he was at that point mentally and emotionally. So very, very sad. I won't play any of that music for you today. If you want to go hear the Mozart Requiem, there's probably 5 performances in Cleveland next year. It's very, very popular and very commonly done. And that brings us to our hero, Franz Joseph Haydn, 1732 to 1809. Lived a good long life. One thing, a funny quote relative to Mozart before I get on to Haydn. Half of the Rebbe's style is compact, concise masses. And he wrote to a friend who said that the Archbishop told him that a mass, the entire mass, with the whole Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Epistle Sonata, Offertory or Motet, the Sanctus and the Agnus Dei must last no longer than 3/4 of an hour. I want to be in, I want to be out in 45 minutes. So figure it out. And by the way that Mozart did that when he came to the big text, the Gloria and the Credo, the way he did it is he actually left out chunks of the text. He truncated the text. He would take some element, and every once in a while he would get kind of snarky about what it was he was leaving out if he thought it would offend the Archbishop or something like that. So there was a particular part of the Credo that would cause a little bit of a scandal. He'd go, okay, I'm going to leave those 2 lines out this time. He would do that. He did not have a good relationship with the poor guy. Haydn will do it differently. We'll talk about that in a minute. So Haydn was a choir boy at St. Stephen's in Vienna, as we said about his brother. He works for the Esterhazy family virtually his entire life. There is a 5-year window where he goes to London because the first Nicholas dies, and the head of the family decides to dissolve the music that goes on. He says, we don't need this. It had become fashionable to get rid of all of your musical servants for some reason. And so he sent Haydn on his way, and Haydn went to London. And that's where he learned about the wonders of Handelian oratorio, got excited about that. When he came back to Vienna and Eisenstadt, after the Esterhazys hired him back, he then proceeds to write his own oratorios, and that's when he writes The Creation and The Seasons. Creation is one of those miracles of music. If you don't know The Creation, it is worth it to find a recording. It is worth it to travel to Cleveland. We ought to do it here. We ought to do it anywhere. It's brilliant. It's amazing. During all of that time, he is writing, he's becoming the great father of the symphony. He writes over 100 symphonies. We talked about that. String quartets out the yin-yang. He's writing a bunch of operas, but he's also writing masses. He writes 14 masses in his life, the last 6 of which come after he returns to Vienna from London. The very end of his life, he is writing for, he writes 6 masses, basically 1 a year, to commemorate the birthday of Nicholas II's wife, whose name was Maria. And so they are the Maria Masses. There are 6 of them total. And they are. All of them are performed fairly regularly. I have sung 5 of these. The Heilige Messe, the Holy Mass, the Missa in Tempore Belli, which is the one that we will be doing in 2 weeks here. That's the Mass in the time of war. And then the Missa in Angustis, the Mass in troubled times. The Teresa Mass, the Creation Mass, and the Harmony Mass, I'm sorry about the misspelling there, the Windan Mass in 1802. So these pieces are all commonly performed. We did the Teresa Mass here in 2012, I believe. And we've done the Harmony Mass. I think we've done the Highland Mass. The Mass in the time of war, as I said before, is, before I get to that, sorry. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Missa Brevis of Haydn, when he writes a short one. Some of his are short, most of these are more in the solemnist style. This is the credo of Haydn's Mass in B flat, which is nicknamed the Little Organ Mass. And it goes like this. Oh, sorry. So could you understand what was going on there? Could you understand the text? Well, I mean, if you knew Latin, that would be one thing. First of all, it's all happening rather quickly. What he's doing is a phrase we have in choral music called telescoping the text. He takes the first 4 lines of the credo, and he gives 1 line to the sopranos, and 1 line to the altos, and 1 line to the tenors, and 1 line to the basses, and says, I'll meet you at the end of 12 measures. And they're all singing their own texts. Clearly, the meaning of the words, and he just goes, you know what we're singing, right? Fine, we're going to make music now. And so the importance of understanding the text as you're singing it clearly is not that important in the classical period. The job was 45 minutes, get in and get out. All right, so how do you do that? Well, Mozart took things out. Haydn's trick was to telescope, to have the 4 texts happening simultaneously. So, the Missa in Tempore Belli, the Pauken Messa, it's called the Pauken Messa as well because it has a timpani part, which is very famous, that you will hear at the end. The piece is called the Mass in the Time of War because Napoleon is doing his thing in Europe at this point, and Austria is fighting against France in places remotely, but they now fear an invasion from France. And so there is a fear in Austria that their sovereignty is about to be compromised. And so for one of the few times in this sort of time period that you can think of, there's almost a hint of a political statement being made here, or at least just get ready, war is coming. And it happens primarily within the last 2 movements of the Mass. It happens within the Benedictus and it happens within the Agnus Dei. I'll play you the Agnus Dei in a minute. Before I do that, I want to play you a little bit of the Kyrie. And sort of lets you hear how Haydn starts the piece. A lot of Haydn's symphonies start with an adagio, an abbreviated maybe 1.5 to 2 minute adagio that just sort of creates a solemnity at the beginning that sort of announces that, hey, we're going to go on a symphonic journey together. And he decides to do that with this Mass as well. So very solemn. And then immediately after that, the soprano comes in, and all of a sudden you're dancing again, and it's back to being Haydn. I want to point out 2 other spots in the piece, and then I'm going to open it up for questions and see what you want to ask me. First of all, I want to play the credos. I played you the other credo, right? This is a Missa Solemnis. This is more expanded. But listen to this. Oop. First of all, it's very happy. I believe in God. But the other thing is that he's still telescoping the text, even though he doesn't have to. This is a piece that isn't. This is a piece that needs to doesn't have to be truncated in any way, and it's still in 3 big sections. The Gloria of this mass is in 3 big sections, kind of like a mini symphony, and so is the Credo. But within the context of that, he's still like, okay, let's go. Let's get through this first initial part of it. And so the soprano, it's actually first bass, then tenor, then alto, then soprano that come in. And each different they each get their own line. Okay, and then you get to the end of that first section, and he goes, Sticheli, and everybody goes, whew. And then a very slow movement comes after that. I want to play one last thing, and it is the Agnus Dei, so that you can hear what makes this the Mass in the time of war. Timpani right there. It sounds rather ominous, does it not? Brass are going to help in that too. So I just wanted to give you a taste of that. That's very, very unique in this kind of music, to be that descriptive, and to suggest that image that overtly is very unusual in this time period. And it's done both with the timpani, the kettle drums, and with those brass is clearly a call to war. Something's coming. And so it makes this piece very unique. We hope you'll all come and hear it when we do it in 2 short weeks. Any questions? Yes, sir.
The last part of that, Agnus Dei is Dona Nobis Pace.
Yes.
Is that particularly emphasized?
Yes. There are a couple of interesting quirks about the piece. The Dona Nobis Pacem, actually, at the very end, is actually, instead of being slow and what you would expect from a dona nobis, most dona nobis pachems are sort of slow and ethereal and meditative. This one is not at all. Da 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 dee da da dee da da na nobis pa dona nobis. It's sort of like, give us peace, give us peace. It's almost hyper. And so it's almost just like we want it and we're insisting on it, but it's a very unusual way to end the piece given the context. Yeah.
The other question I had is it a particularly difficult challenge to direct telescopic pieces?
It is difficult from the standpoint of everybody who is singing a different text at a different time. You have to get everybody. The challenge of being a choir in an orchestral context is that you have to get to the vowels of syllables exactly at the right time. It's the one aspect of what we do that's more complicated than the orchestra. The orchestra is more complicated in almost every way. They play more different lines of music at the same time, but in terms of phonating pitch and actually saying, we want this sound to start now, language makes that job infinitely more difficult for the chorus than it is for the orchestra. An orchestra goes up bow, down bow, or pluck. They have 3 ways to phonate a pitch. You can do it in an infinite variety of ways, the strings, but pretty much that's what they do, 99.9% of the time. Meanwhile, a singer has to get through a bunch of consonants and agree on a vowel, and the vowel has to happen at the right time. And when you're doing that with 4 texts simultaneously, that's funky. That's really hard. And so you do a lot of work where you take the text out of it completely, and you just do a do, or something like that, and you just say, okay, this is how it sounds when we're not doing all this other stuff. Now, let's figure out if we can actually get the texts to line up and be at the right time. It's hard. It's very hard. It's the one thing that makes us more complicated. That and just being singers. Being a singer is just hard. You know, there are no buttons to push, there's not a fretboard or anything like that. That makes it hard. But the other thing is language, for sure. Yes, sir.
Do you know, or do you have any ideas on why the Greek has been retained in those 3 lines of the Kyrie, even today?
Go for it, Father Pat.
Right, well, the original language of the Roman Empire was Greek. And so the Masters originally celebrated Aramaic, that's what Jesus spoke. And then when Peter and Paul and the Christian community moved to the center of Rome, the center of it, for the first 200, 300 years since the birth of Christ, it was spoken, Greek was the language of the Roman Empire. Then it transmuted to Latin, but that was retained from an earlier version of that.
It's always good to have a Catholic priest around. Yes, sir.
Last week, very well-revered contemporary composer of liturgical music spoke at St. Michael's, Marty Hagen.
Yes.
And many of his beloved songs deal with social issues, welcoming the alien, feeding the hungry, powerful works of mercy. And they said, this is not new. This goes back to the 1940s. And I thought that's not very far back. I mean, does it go back far? Does that kind of social concern surface in earlier liturgical music, or was it really a 20th century phenomenon?
I think there is an argument. There are arguments to be made that the Magnificat is actually a socially activist text, because of the I can't remember specifics now. I was at a talk where they talked about this. But the things that, praying for the lowly handmaiden and all this sort of stuff, it is all basically a socially issue-driven prayer. And so I think it goes back to the beginnings of Christianity. It's a question of whether we recognize it that way or not. Good question, Dan. That was good. All right. Anybody else? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Hi.
Hi. You said all this is going on in Germany and Austria.
Yeah.
But the Pope was in Italy. What? Was there a similar thing with lesser composers in Italy and France?
Yes, although if you were in Italy, you were following the Pope's mandates pretty closely. So there wasn't as much of a, my understanding is that wasn't as much of an issue between the state and the church at that point. But in Austria, especially, where the majority of the music that we still hold on to, there is music. I actually went through a list of about 14 composers that are supposed to be composers of classical music and masses in a couple of books that I found. And some of them are from Italy and some of them are from France, but nobody knows them. And I mean, I've been in this music, I've been listening to this music for 25 years and I didn't recognize half of their names. But an example of somebody who is Italian but resided in Austria is Salieri. Salieri was a wildly popular composer in his day. His music just hasn't translated to modern audiences because Mozart and Haydn was better. But he, Salieri was well known for being very crafty. He was a very smart businessman. And so when he worked for Emperor Joseph II, he did what Emperor Joseph II said. He wasn't interested in what the Pope said. Why were we Anything else? Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for having me.